Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. It's a new year, but Appsec has some predictive lessons from the past. In 1975, sci-fi author John Brunner predicted and named the computer worm in his novel Shockwave Rider. In the 80s, cyberpunk exploded, and William Gibson's short story Burning Chrome gave us the term and concept of cyberspace. But even back in the 60s, and well before the ubiquity of personal computers, there was the Star Trek communicator, which of course predicted that personal devices would always track and give away our location info. Which means this week we chat with Cody Scott about cybersecurity and privacy predictions for 2025. Head to the future and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest Appsec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. IT professionals, mark your calendars. Zero Trust World 2025 is happening in Orlando, Florida, February 19th to 21st. This event is tailored for IT leaders and cybersecurity experts who want actionable insights on zero trust strategies, practical solutions for modern threats, and meaningful connections with industry peers. Plus, take advantage of hands-on cyber hero boot camps, expert-led sessions, and the chance to earn CPE credits and your Cyber Hero certificate. Save $200 on your in-person registration using discount code ZTWSW25 at securityweekly.com/ZTW2025. Reserve your spot now. AI is transforming applications, but with innovation comes new risks. Enter Noma, the first application security platform built to secure the entire data and AI lifecycle. From your AI supply chain to models and runtime, Noma protects it all. With a single platform that integrates seamlessly across your data pipelines, Jupyter Notebooks, ML Ops tools, code, and application SDKs, Noma delivers full lifecycle visibility, security, and compliance. Start securing your data and AI lifecycle at securityweekly.com/Noma. This is episode 314, recorded for January 20th, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with Kalyani Pawar. Hello, Kalyani. Good to see you.
Hey, good to see you too.
And we've also got, once again, Adrian is joining us. Hello, Adrian.
Hey there. Always nice to be here.
And of course, that is Adrian Sanabria, for those of you new to the entire Security Weekly network. He was quite a good face for us back in 2024. And I was going to mention how Neil Stephenson coined and described metaverse, but that just remains fiction. So who cares? We do have Cody, who is a senior analyst at Forrester covering cyber risk management with a focus on cyber risk quantification, enterprise risk management, and GRC. He has 10 years of experience in the security field, leading complex projects, building high-performing teams, and transforming cybersecurity and privacy programs. Prior to Forrester, Cody served as the first chief cybersecurity risk officer of NASA. Before joining the civil service, Cody worked as a consultant, supporting technology projects and programs across the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, the TSA, and, again, NASA. Hello, Cody. Thank you for beaming down and joining us.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
We're excited to have you and talk about predictions for 2025. Now, we don't need to be quite so grand as the few of the sci-fi authors that perhaps I mentioned in the beginning, but I do want to kind of kick off just where your predictions come from. Sort of, did you pull these out of, a random table at the appendix of a Dungeon Master's Guide? Were you just rolling some dice? Why should we listen to you today, Cody?
Excellent question to start. And yes, these did not just come out of a black hole, and this was not the result of a D&D game, although that does sound way more fun. So,
Agreed.
No, so, the way that we approach predictions, this is something Forrester has done for a while. And This is not, we use the term prediction very specifically here because what you do see a lot of are people putting out what they call trends. And trends are really just building on the momentum of what they're already seeing. Not a lot of boldness there, not a lot of really kind of that forward-looking element you would expect. And what we really try to do and what we strive for with predictions in this case is to say, what is a key transformation or a key change that is just on the horizon that we're not quite seeing yet, but is still plausible and could happen? So, this is a fun part for our Forrester analysts because we get to be creative, we get to have a little bit of fun with it. And even if we're wrong, we get to do a retroactive and kind of go back and figure out what did happen or what didn't happen and where the world is today as a result. So with these in particular, the predictions that we're going to talk about, where did we get them? We get them by talking to folks like you, talking to industry, talking to people across all different industries of different sizes of company, practitioners across a variety of fields and experiences. And we're looking at what the pain points are, what the challenges are, and where we're seeing broader signals in the market and in industry with common practices to build what those predictions would be. So that's a little bit of the sauce or the methodology for how we get there, but that's our approach.
And I love that the point is these are near term. This isn't something we're predicting for 2035, 2045. At the end of the year, ostensibly, we'll have you back on and go through that report to see what was, what were you close to, what were you off, and a little bit of why. And to put you on the spot a little bit, did you do this for 2024 and maybe give us a little bit of a hint how your track record was for 2024 before we figure out what this year is going to look like?
Yes. So Forrester, we put out a report for 2024, wildly different predictions than what we were predicting for 2025. Actually, I myself was not on that prediction team, so I can't so much say how accurate they were. But
Convenient.
Yes. So I am not to blame for anything that went well or did not go well. No, jokes aside, it was actually a really interesting assessment, and I know the team is looking back on that for a retroactive. But some of the things that were bold in our predictions and things that actually have come true were some things that we predicted around, for example, like 90% of breaches will include a human element, and we've seen a lot of survey data that shows that has indeed become the case. Another big area of focus, zero trust is not a new topic for anyone at this point, but the proliferation and I would say the systematic approach to making zero trust an actual practical priority within an organization, that did happen. And we predicted that roles with zero trust titles would double across public and private sectors. And we have a lot of survey data that shows directionally that was heading in the right way. And then another element I'll touch on is we were highlighting and tracking trends, we had our prediction around data breaches that were attributed to, or rather blamed on, AI-generated code. And we are starting to see that too. So those were interesting things that we were kind of looking at the forefront of 2024 and have been tracking ever since.
Gotcha. Yeah. And thanks for that bit of preamble, bit of background. And because you mentioned AI, Gen AI, I'm going to guess that's going to be a bit of a hint to 2025. So why don't we, raise the curtains, insert the drum roll, and tell us what 2025 looks like. What are some predictions?
Yes. So why don't we start with the Gen AI one? So we can't not talk about that in 2025, of course. But the prediction that we've put out there, and it's maybe ruffled a few feathers, maybe not, but we had a prediction that CISOs in particular will deprioritize Gen AI use and those use cases by 10% due to the lack of quantifiable value. Now, there's a lot of trends that are happening around Gen AI, the use of LLMs and security, but our prediction is focusing more on the negative aspect, or rather the lack of return on value that we're seeing from Gen AI, specifically applied to cybersecurity use cases. And we're looking at this from a broad impact perspective because we're saying that CISOs overall will step back their overall program budget allocation towards Gen AI use by up to 10%. And that's pretty substantial when we're talking about entire security programs and the spend that they're putting towards Gen AI itself, balancing the promises with the actual return or lack thereof.
Yeah, I think that to me resonates well. That doesn't sound or feel controversial to me. We started off this year with a interview with Greg Anderson from Defect Dojo, and one of the principles that came out of that conversation was just the idea of, from Appsec, where's the value? And we were focused on where's the value of an Appsec tool that is delivering. But here too, so much of what we covered here in 2024 was prompt injection, yet another prompt injection. I don't really think I'll cover yet another prompt injection in 2025 because that's boring and it's not finding value. And I'm not sure though, Kalyani or Adrian, if does this rub you the wrong way? Are you going to start spending more time and money on AI investment in Appsec? Let's start with you, Adrian.
Yeah, so yeah, the value here. Yeah, so I'm advising a Gen AI SOC startup. The moment I jump off this podcast, I've got a call scheduled, and that's why I've got a hard stop at the end of our recording time here. But yeah, the more I talk to these folks, the more it seems to be really about automation, and the generative AI piece is more messaging or signaling for investment, right? The investors are going to latch on to whatever they latch on to. I helped, back when I was still in startup land, I helped the CEO prep for the innovation sandbox at RSA. And we very intentionally avoided saying AI because we didn't really find it useful for what we were doing. It was a SaaS security startup in the SSPM. And we get nailed for that by the judges, who were mostly VCs on Innovation Sandbox. Like the very first question is, how are you using AI? And Yoav, he spun it well, but yeah, I think a lot of it does have to do with investment signaling. And, the more I talk to these companies, the important bits are, a lot of the SOC tasks are very repeatable, just like in Appsec as well. Mm-hmm. And it's just basic old school automation, capturing what those workflows look like, figuring out where a human does need to insert themselves and review something, and automating the stuff where they don't.
Yeah, I would say just to that point too, my two of my colleagues, Jeff Pollard and Ali Mellon, they wrote a report talking about more of the use cases for
very
Gen
spicy.
AI. Yeah. And the interesting thing that they talk about a lot is the fact that a lot of the Gen AI products in security are built for CISOs in name only. And I think that that's, to your point, a lot of that AI moniker is virtue signaling with a lot of promises around productivity being the core measure, not actually going beyond that to look at what is the greater security value, which is something that I'm very interested in a risk quantification perspective. But then also just, the overall utility. It makes it really hard to win that fight when you're convincing folks that the AI is going to add productivity when the results do not show themselves, as you said.
Yeah, I don't see it so much as adding productivity as removing stuff we shouldn't be doing in the first place. Like a lot of security tools create a lot of busy work that doesn't, like if you look at most vulnerability management programs, most of those vulnerabilities are never going to result in any kind of real, negative outcomes. Cattail. Mike's cat has an opinion on this, and so I see it as well. And still, that's ROI, right? Like reducing waste. Time that we're wasting on things that we shouldn't be wasting time on. I guess it's still a positive. I've always kind of seen the SOC as a as a symptom of a larger problem in that, the SIM and SOAR tools just generate too much noise and require too much labor to take care of for not a whole lot of value. And, that's why we've got butts and seats, just analyzing all this stuff. So, if it can help us waste less, I don't see it increasing productivity. I see it as reducing waste.
Also like when I think about Appsec and then startups, we're already on a resource constraint. So, speaking about productivity, like if that AI powered SOC is not going to give me any productive results when I already am short on resources, especially in like, say, people bandwidth, like the headcount wise or budget wise, I do, however, see the use of something like Cursor or Copilot, but like obviously it also has its drawbacks, like introducing its own form of vulnerabilities or what have you. But yeah, I think with resource constraint, just this unnecessary chaos and unnecessary paranoia around like, oh my God, are we going to get hacked? I think that is still an issue with Gen AI.
And I think that "are we going to get hacked" question actually comes up in some other of your predictions as well, and especially where that CISO budget or the security budget may have to be spent on. If we're doing a few percentage points less on Gen AI, there's going to be some more elsewhere, isn't there, Cody?
There is, although one thing that I'll say too, before I jump to that, is that it's also interesting just, that point about the waste versus the productivity. I think that that's spot on, because the other challenge here too is that CISOs and CIOs want to get productivity gains. They actually, for a while, our survey data showed that 35% of CISOs and CIOs globally thought that they could use Gen AI to improve employee productivity as their number one priority for the digital workplace. But what we're seeing again is that that's just not proving out. What we do see, on the other hand, is across a variety of markets, not even just in like the SOC, for example, but even in the GRC market or the cyber GRC team. Where we see the most value add in a Gen AI use case is actually on the very remedial manual tasks and data processing tasks that need to happen. And that's where folks are getting the most bang. It's just unfortunately not the most sexy thing to go and advertise as a feature, but that is where folks actually do start to see the benefit there. Now, on that hack piece, yeah, this was really interesting because I think I love this prediction. So the prediction is that a major IoT breach will disrupt a large class of devices. And the interesting thing here is that you could look at that and say, all right, yes, okay, traditionally there has been, we've known that IoT devices are vulnerable. We know that, we need better security around them. So what really is the prediction here? Well, the prediction is actually focusing more on the systemic impact, because the growing pressure here is that, yes, for a long time, these devices have been insecure. But the other pressure rising is that they are becoming vastly more prolific in modern enterprises. Companies who, traditionally 5-10 years ago wouldn't think that IoT is even on their radar, or it's a small component of it. But what we're actually finding is that, Fortune 500 companies, small companies, they have to also realize that this is within their purview, and there are more IoT devices in their modern, in the technology that their organization uses than perhaps they realized. And so our prediction is focused on this large attack. And, a funny thing too is, as we were writing this prediction, nothing had yet happened. When we published the prediction, it did actually happen. So we did see this with an event where there were pagers exploding in Lebanon, for example, and that was, signaled due to a coordinated attack based on those devices from a supply chain-based compromise. So it's really interesting to see that, but we only think that this is going to get worse, and we think we'll see more of it in 2025.
And that's one that I initially reacted to like, oh, this sounds a little bit of easy mode. Kind of 2024 zero trust would be another one that I might try not to be overly cynical, but just say, oh, that's very common. Everybody still talks about IoT, OT, technical side of it being sort of, we know it's insecure, but you were pointing out, we had a conversation before this, that it's not just the technical aspect. You kind of hinted on it in your response just now, but I'd love if you could talk about the non-technical side of why you were focusing on this as a particular prediction.
Yeah. So, just to reiterate the technical side, you've got it's hard to talk about IoT as one type of device, because obviously we know it's a lot of different types of devices. It's the hardware and the software on those. And so there's quite a lot of complexity in and of itself in that case. And then as those tech use cases evolve and you get more devices, it just adds more complexity. But that's the technical side. Then there's what I call the programmatic side, which goes into really that challenge that I said of organizations understanding what is and is not within their purview. So I'll just give an example. Back in my government days working at NASA, there was a very distinct distinction between IoT and IT devices, or OT and IT devices. One was very squarely within the, very kind of robust management structure that have been put in place, and here are the specific processes that need to be followed. Here are the policies for vulnerability management, for security assessments, for incident response that need to be done based on those devices. But when you throw in IoT to the mix, waiver, risk acceptance. Why? Well, we don't have the tools to do continuous monitoring. We don't have a way to impact this. That tool is really part of this team over here, and we think that there's no risk associated with it. And that's programmatically, that's been the excuse for a lot of organizations for a long time. And that's because it's complicated, right? But what we are seeing and what this prediction focuses on is, again, that systemic impact, the scale of impact here. And this can't just be a problem that we push into a dark room in the closet and close the door and just say, okay, it's there, we know about it, but, maybe it's sealed off, maybe it's not. It's becoming, pretty substantial, and it's the scale with which it's impacting organizations. So that programmatic aspect really is, in some ways, I would argue maybe even more complicated because it's a people problem. It's a cultural problem, and there's a lot of friction around how do we manage this? How do we bring this into the way that we manage security in our organization today? And the more pressing question, do we have the right security tech stack to be able to continuously monitor or secure those kinds of devices? Most organizations do not, and in some cases there aren't solutions for that. So it becomes a pretty substantial problem. In that regard, the programmatic reinforces the technical challenges, and it's a vicious cycle.
In 2024, CISO made a really big deal about secure by design, secure by defaults, pushing for memory safety, which is probably more applicable to the OT world than it is to the web application world, to be honest, because we have plenty of web applications written in memory safe languages that are still getting lots of bug bounty reports against them. Do you see that, is there going to be something simple, I would say? I'm pretty sure the answer is already no, but this programmatic change getting more ownership, more investment from the CISO or the security group that's going to be able to influence that technical direction? Or is this still just, it takes a long time to deal with the inertia here?
My opinion here is that there's always going to be inertia. There's always going to be the lagging tail where it's going to take a while to still see, mass change here. But there is a lot of good momentum. So the secure by design concept is really, challenging the conventional way that folks think about this. And it's giving an extra stick in their chest, an extra tool to go and use and say, hey, we need to enforce requirements against this, or we need to actually do something against this in some cases. There's also, I know we talk about zero trust, tongue in cheek being the solution to everything. But, if we look at zero trust, fundamentally, zero trust principles do also help with an IoT infrastructure. If we can think about how to bring that in, we just need to make sure that we're extending the lens when we're building our zero trust based solutions, that we're extending that lens where possible. And then, one of the recommendations that we at Forrester give is what we call our secure what you sell model, which is really a set of minimum security requirements, looking at minimum viable security for systems, whether they're products that are being managed or your own infrastructure internally. But the idea is fundamentally, if you recognize that you've got this asset class, how are you securing that asset? What is the minimum standard that you can apply? And having a short-term and a long-term view for making sure that you get to the right level of security based on your risk profile. So those directions, those spearheads, I think, are really helping to change the conversation and reprioritize this so that we hopefully don't see a large class of devices that are impacting organizations. But given the scope right now and the lack of security, that is very challenging and could result in some potentially devastating consequences.
Part of that too is, that sounds a little bit like CISA's also one of their secure by design principles is, how is it phrased? Taking responsibility for customer outcomes. That's sounds like a synonym of, secure what you sell. I'm curious, Adrian, since you're quite busy, I don't know if maybe this afternoon on Monday, you're also advising an OT startup as well. What does, when you hear this, does it sound similar to my reaction, the sense of IoT always insecure, or is there something else that comes up for you?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of factors here, and it's mostly not been addressed. Ultimately, a lot of it comes back to the market. A lot of these CES is going on right now, and there's this rush to shove a computer into everything, right? And we're even seeing industry split by this. You've got your Tesla and Rivian, who are software first, born software savvy companies, and then these 100-year-old Daimler Benz and Ford and all these companies that are kind of being pulled into it, kicking and screaming. So a lot of the IoT companies, aren't yet following best practices. I think when the Nissan Leaf came out, all you needed with the mobile app for the Nissan Leaf was the VIN number to control someone's car, like not drivetrain or anything, but you could lock and unlock the car. You could roll down the windows. All you needed was the VIN number, which is going to show up in any, it's public. It's like the address of a house on a real estate website. Nobody keeps the VIN number private. And still today, just the other day, I forget what the device was, but they were using the serial number of the device as the only authentication to access the API that would allow you to control that device. So, regulations haven't quite come in here yet. California said you can't have default passwords on consumer routers, and consumer devices anymore. We just saw the U.S. Cyber Trust Mark release, which has been a couple years in development. And United Laboratories is, I think, the lead assessor for that. They've got like a dozen different companies that can assess it, but it's voluntary. So I think we're going to see, and I think that's kind of the right way to go right now, where they're actually using security and the fact that there's going to be this mark on the packaging. And again, this mark is just for consumer devices that connect to your Wi-Fi at home. So it's not industrial IoT, it's not OT, it's not touching any of that stuff yet. But this is kind of the beginning of using security as a selling point and a potential competitive advantage over other companies that aren't quite there yet. Especially as we see more and more headlines where these devices are enabling people to do bad stuff, violating privacy, that kind of things. Like automobiles are a nightmare. I don't know if you guys ever saw that review from Mozilla where they gave every single automaker a failing grade on privacy, where they're collecting everything from microphones into cars, tracking your car. A lot of these vehicles, they can take away your access to your car at any point in time. They can push a button and brick it.
It points to a spectacular example of the SaaS. Like your car is now almost just an extension of a SaaS device that if your subscription ends, you, as Adrian pointed out, maybe it'll be locked, unlocked, or it's just bricked.
And then I didn't even mention John Deere, and this whole like, do you even own your devices? Because they lock you out, force you into expensive maintenance contracts and stuff like that.
Yeah, and right to repair for the last 2 years at the very least, if not longer. That's been a very recurring theme of DEF CON in particular. And we've seen slow changes that are more beneficial now to researchers, but as I mentioned, it's very slow. Cody, you mentioned at the very beginning, like one of the examples was the pagers, walkie-talkies that were exploding. Those were less about obviously like a buffer overflow or something within the tech stack of the device. That was very much a supply chain and a very in-depth, long-term type of attack. Similar in vein, I will say, just in the sense of planning, like the XZ Utils was of 2024. And you have another, one more of your predictions is related to supply chain, but it's a little bit. It's once again, thankfully, it's not very vapid. You're coming up with predictions that look like they're going to make us think about by the end of the year. What does this one look like related to supply chain?
Yeah. So one of our other predictions here is that a Western government will bar specific third-party or open source software, and what we mean by that is, so XZ Utils hack is a really good example. We're looking at, there are so many other kind of supply chain compromise-based examples that we could point to that show just the growing concern around the nature of open source software, the third-party availability or the lack of insights into how that third-party software is being managed. And the problem here is that the government is really starting to pay attention to this. So we say a Western government just because we're looking at this admittedly from more of a US perspective, but we also see growing conversations happening in the EU as well. But mainly, even in the US, you've got big topics around getting more insights into the software bill of materials, for example, to help overcome that supply chain challenge. But we think that given the scale and the cadence and the problems and, frankly, the national security concerns that come up with open source software, the lack of insights around that, we think the government's going to act swiftly here, because this is an area where there are a lot of unknowns. The government does not have a high risk tolerance when it comes to things like this, especially with national security implications. And it's becoming a little bit too regular that government agencies in particular are hacked due to or experience breaches due to supply chain related concerns. When you add in the software element and the open source software element, that makes it such a complicated concern for a lot of the federal decision makers. So our prediction is really around action. We think that governments are going to shut this off until basically they can get better protections in place to figure out how to address it.
That's interesting to me, and it has a little bit of a tie back to when we started off talking about Gen AI and LLM, sort of where is the value, or just where are we wasting time? Why are we doing the same things over and over again? And what comes to my mind is, especially with open source software, is just patching lots of low quality vulns that may never be exploited or aren't even exploitable, but we as Appsec teams are telling engineers or developers, just clear out this backlog of 10,000 items, or use an LLM to clear out that backlog, when maybe we shouldn't be talking about that backlog in the first place. It's just cruft. So here I'm curious then is there's, to use the term again, the idea of trust in these open source projects and who's maintaining them. There's going to be there's already a tension just between, we've seen package repos say we're going to require multi-factor authentication, and some package maintainers objecting to that, or objecting to not being able to be as anonymous, which sounds very much against what something like what you're describing with the government wants. So as I'm trying to get a question to come out of here. There's a couple of directions I want to go and bring in Kalyani and Adrian as well. But you did mention SBOMs, and I definitely want to get in front of the idea of what SBOMs are used for. Because it's very easy to say, oh, SBOMs didn't protect us from Log4j because SBOMs don't protect us from buffer overflows or from command execution. And that to me is just a category error when people react to that. So you're mentioning SBOMs here fondly, or favorably at least. Help us understand why SBOMs can be viewed favorably.
Yeah, so, I like to think of SBOMs as they are control. They are a risk control in an organization, but they're not the control that people think they are. This is not an operational control that's going to shut down a problem and prevent a hack. What it is more of a prevention element that helps with the identification side. So by understanding, or by leveraging an SBOM, what we're doing is we're giving ourselves visibility into an area that we don't necessarily have visibility, which then allows decision makers to do things like prioritize where they need to apply better security controls, where they need to apply better patching or increase the cadence thereof, to better prioritize which things are actually worth our time from a security perspective, or is it better to just go maybe build our own library in this case than using the open source one? We can't know that if we don't know what's actually in that software or in that application that we're using. And I think that's why I look at it more favorably, just because I think there is a misperception around what people think an SBOM is intended to do versus the very real risk management value that it contributes to that conversation, at least in that planning side.
This also reminds me of one of the areas where we as Appsec can waste time very easily is the idea that we're going to review and approve every single open source project. That just does not scale, nor do I think is that something where an LLM is going to be able to successfully say. You can't have a fundamentally non-deterministic system come up and make a very important security decision that needs a deterministic output, needs to be repeatable every time. So I don't know if this is the type of thing, Kalyani, is your view of startups, especially small, where you're trying to focus valuable effort, looking at your just third-party dependencies, bringing in open source. How much of this scares you, or how much of this have you seen there's some value from some tools that are helping you out on this area?
I want to say that it definitely scares me, but I want to approach this in like different ways. We're talking about security debt here, right? And then we're also talking about like open source stuff, but then we're also talking about risk prioritization. And I think now that we're short on bandwidth, what is more of our priority? Is it like using open source tools for authentication? Then yes, that's definitely like a high risk criteria. I think another thing that plays a role in all this, like there's this common misconception that VCs don't really care about security, and I feel like off late I'm starting to see like this gradual change in conversations with VCs where they do understand that this is a business risk, and so I think sometimes that does play a role in understanding if you can translate this language into a VC language where you can explain that this is a business risk. I do see this positive impetus on making that change, which also brings me to my next question is, have you seen this change with VCs, Cody, where they seem more security aware now?
I would say that there's a lot of interest. While that, I don't get into as many conversations with that, I have spoken to quite a few of them who at least, they'll come to us and say, how should we think about this? How should we even start to assess security? So I think directionally and anecdotally on my experience, the fact that they're even asking what they should consider, like is a SOC 2 type 2 appropriate enough, or is there more we should look at? That's really encouraging. I love that. But I don't think enough people are asking that question, unfortunately.
And then as part of this is we're looking at solutions. I think Kalyani's, talking about VCs are looking for where's a good tool, where do we invest in solutions? You explained, Cody, about where SBOMs fit in here, but looking at this as a prediction at the end of 2025, is there something you would hope to see from the industry based on this idea of, yes, maybe a Western government is going to ban a particular XZ Utils or something else that's been compromised? I think you also make an example of polyfill.io. That starts to touch on national security areas. We can bring in TikTok, ByteDance into the conversation as well. Not an open source third-party dependency, but I think it's similar thematically. So rather than just, let's say that some open source project package does get banned, how are organizations supposed to react to that? What are they going to do?
Well, there's two things here. One, so the general problem right now is that, yes, SBOMs, kind of like a pie in the sky, nice thing to do, but really it needs a good technology solution to make it more viable and scalable for folks to move at the speed of business that they need to. And the reality is that the tech is just not really there to do that yet. My colleague, Janet Worthington, has a lot of really great insights into this, and she talks extensively about this in the Appsec space with her coverage. But so that's one element, is where we need to see a better solution out there for SBOMs to make that a little bit more viable, so that it doesn't become what it is becoming, unfortunately, which is just more of a checkbox thing that's done after the fact. And that is the worst case scenario for an SBOM. That's not where we want it. It's not adding really any operational value at that point. But that brings me into the second challenge here with the consideration. So if the government does do this, what then? Well, the problem is that the government likely could do this based on our prediction, which would be a pendulum swing really far in the other direction. That might be a little bit too difficult, because from a market perspective, what does that signal? That signals that all open source is bad. And that's not necessarily the case either. So that makes it really hard to do business. And that's where this is going to be most impacted, is by companies who are doing business with the government, because they will have those contractual obligations. And that's going to be a bad signal. And it's going to raise the cost of doing business too. That could be prohibitive for a lot of these, like especially startup application providers who are out there. So there's a challenge there. I think, this does remind me of the swing that we see generally in both the GRC and the cyber risk space with regulation, which is regulation pivots really hard in one way to say you must adopt and implement these sets of controls and standards. And then there's very little work done to unpack what the overall objective is versus the level of risk that there might be around it. And that's where you get into the really problematic situation of thinking that all regulation is immediately equal to a compliance obligation. And that's not true, because really what it might what the requirement might be is that you need to have a way to continuously monitor the open source components and adapt, your protective controls in real time based on some kind of signal or indicator. But if you don't have the tech there, you don't know what that looks like operationally, you don't have the maturity or experience to even deploy something like that, how would you know to do it? So the default action is, well, we're just not allowed to do it. Tough luck. I need an extra $1 million to go re-architect this whole thing. And that's not the right answer either. So I think that, if this does come true, the unfortunate reality will be that this hurts a lot of business. But we are hopefully, in my mind, because I like to think that there are champions out there in the compliance and regulatory world who want to make sure that we don't get to that point. And they work backwards to say what are allowed use cases or prohibited use cases, or what are minimum sets of standards that we would expect based on degrees of uses. And that is, frankly, reflective of the trend in government, too. When the last executive order, cybersecurity executive order was put out, mainly it was focused on zero trust, but there were a lot of provisions around software supply chain risk management that said, based on the nature of the software and how the government agency is using that software, so whether it's more infrastructure-based versus if it's just, kind of some like project management application or something that someone's using, there are different standards that apply. I'm hoping that we get to that kind of discussion sooner rather than later in this case, because we don't want to see that business killer side come into play due to overregulation.
And I want to make a comment too that we talk about open source just because it's so prevalent. It's the numbers are at least 80% of most SaaS, most software is open source. So it's not just open source as a pejorative, meaning it's insecure. And I'm curious here why, this is so much of, a government may bar I guess you do say third party or open source software. Would that also apply, or do you think that would, if we go back to that OT and IoT device security, would they bar an OT device, an IoT device just from being used because this is where a consequential breach is coming from?
Well, yes, and we've actually already seen that. So if you think about, there were government regulations a couple of years ago that were banning specific products from certain countries. There are lots of regulations that do that. So whether it's devices that are coming from, for example, Russia, China, things like that, there are different rules. Granted, there are different, things that you can do depending on the business need, and there's different levels of assessment that go into it. But there are acquisition bans that have been put in place for devices at that level. I think it's very safe to assume that we could see that for software too. And the part of the driver here too is when we think about that national security interest, it's not just because it's the nature of the software, as you said, it's not just because it's open source on its own. It has to do more with the provenance of it and who's maintaining it and the lack of knowledge about who the people are. So, with some of those hacks that we've talked about before, in many cases, it could be foreign nationals who might be affiliated with state-sponsored groups that bring a whole different dimension into it that, frankly, is just outside the day-to-day work that, Appsec people are normally doing in their day-to-day job, trying to manage this stuff within their products.
And I suppose as 2024 has proved, I think there's a lot of at least admins out there who are voluntarily getting rid of all their VPN devices, since those have been an unfortunate expansion of their attack surface for companies. So it doesn't have to be governments; it could be voluntarily too.
I think I referred to VPNs, particularly FTP software, as the asbestos of IT at this point. It's just more risk than it's worth. Like, move to something else.
Absolutely. As we, I want to expand now the conversation a little bit to having a little bit of fun and maybe putting my co-hosts here on the spot about their own predictions. Adrian, you were just talking about the asbestos of the internet. Is there something in 2025 that you would add to Cody's list, or that you might modify or tweak a bit?
Yeah, I tend to stay away from making predictions, and I instead like to share my hopes.
Yeah, there we are. Good answer.
Do in 2025, and absolutely, I brought up a whole thing on getting rid of FTP and some of these antiquated things that just tend to cause more problems than not. Like, even if it's not a vulnerability in it, it's just too often misconfigured. But the one that really grabbed me is still generative AI. It's a lot of what we talk about on my podcast. I can't get away from it. I do a lot of advisory calls with folks on it. And right now, the enterprises that I'm advising, they're full speed ahead on building generative AI into internal software, into products that they're planning on exposing to either their customers or the public internet. Some obvious places for that, call centers, support, that kind of thing. Like it's super easy to just put together a RAG that's your knowledge base or your support scripts. It seems like a slam dunk use case, but none of their security teams are feeling ready for it. And all the companies in this space, didn't exist before ChatGPT. So everybody's seed stage, everybody's Series A, like nobody's figured this out yet. So I have absolutely no indication of whether or not any of these, because we've got a ton of these security products that are basically going to be shimmed in between the prompt requests and then the output, both looking for abuse coming in, which are really easy to spot. So what I'm telling a lot of people is that you need to look at the prompts coming in, because when somebody's trying to get around your alignment or system prompting, it's really obvious. It's like, my grandma's going to die if you don't, give the password for, like, it looks like social engineering. It looks really weird. So it's easy to spot. But then, making sure sensitive data doesn't come back out on the other end, that's a little bit trickier. That's kind of a classic data loss prevention, DLP type situation. And that's been an unsolved problem forever. And then a lot of these companies are using LLMs or using the same technology to try and solve these issues with it. So that's going to be interesting as well. So yeah, my prediction is, or my hope is that we figure some of that out this year. Do we need a third-party product to do this? AWS Bedrock has already started adding some of this stuff, so I'm not sure these standalone startups are going to get very far. And if it does work, going back again to the use generative AI to replace tier one SOC folks. I think we're going to start to see a whole lot of acquisitions here if it actually does work. I think this market's going to get acquired very quickly or die very quickly.
It'll happen quickly, so we'll definitely check back with you, Adrian, at the end of the year on that one. Kalyani, let's reframe this as what are your hopes for 2025?
I hope to make more bug bounty in Gen AI. No, that's just kidding. Just kidding. I'm hopeful. So, we talk about...
It's a slam dunk prediction, by the way.
Yeah.
I've been trying, sometimes in the evening, I've been trying to try different prompt injections. Similarly, yeah, my bum is going to die, but yeah. We talk about zero trust and, security by design and sell what you secure. But something I really want to see this year is privacy by design, right? We're talking about LLMs, and we're talking about feeding all the sensitive data to it. In fact, the other day I learned that Slack uses AI to have certain conversations. And then there was another paper where you can leak sensitive data from Slack from your conversations. And so I think I'm very hopeful to start reading up more about privacy by design this year, especially now that we're headed in this direction of baking Gen AI in so many development processes.
And it's in the last 2 or 3 years, at least on my radar, I've seen the development of privacy engineering as a discipline, as a role. Yeah. So hopefully that does actually grow, to your point, Kalyani. And as we start to wrap up here, Cody, your report here has 5 predictions. 5, there always needs to be a cutoff. Was there a number 6? Was there something else that you really wanted to get out there, but you just didn't have time to put on the list, or something else that would just be fun that you don't want to commit all your co-authors to as well?
Oh, there were so many. I mean, narrowing down to a list of 5 was a huge challenge in and of itself. Because frankly, I mean, we have our fingers on the pulse of just so many different things that are happening right now. Gosh, if I had to pick a number 6, I don't know if I can put one on the spot, but I will say, just to give a little bit of flavor, though, for maybe what some of the other ones were, we were really leaning into, there was a second one around Gen AI in particular, which does, I think, get into the privacy piece a little bit, because I agree with you, the privacy side is lacking. And it was specifically around the EU AI Act and the way that regulators will get involved, and the fact that they're probably going to get involved a lot faster in finding Gen AI providers than they have before in the past, especially with GDPR. So that's really interesting. Our colleague Enza talks a lot about privacy engineering, actually. So that's, I think, a great topic that needs a lot more attention. The other one that I would mention too is around the fact that we have a prediction that breach-related class action costs are going to surpass regulatory fines by 50%. So I won't go into that one. I'll leave that as a teaser for everyone to look at, and maybe that's something we can come back to. But if I did have to go into maybe a sixth one, I think I would lean more into it's actually following from a prediction we had last year, which was around 90% of breaches will involve a human element. And I think I would probably add in something around the human risk side for a number 6 prediction, because that has just blown up exponentially in terms of interest from clients that we talk to, the concerns thereof, how to actually architect a human risk program and make that a core component of a security program. I think that's a really interesting opportunity that could really transform the way that security programs have conventionally worked. But it's something that's just out of reach right now for a lot of folks. And so I think that's a really exciting space, and I would lean into that one.
That sounds fun. I think I was going to say, well, I absolutely have to have you on again at the end of the year just to check the predictions. But that particular topic sounds fun too, because I would love to have that conversation around how are the systems and designs failing the humans rather than just pointing to humans made that mistake. But that unfortunately is going to have to be a discussion for another time, because Cody, we asked you about these 5 predictions. You gave us helpfully a 6th one, some insight on others. But I'm going to throw another number at you and constrain you even more. We've been asking our guests this year, describe Appsec in 3 words. So hit us up. What's your response to that?
Yes, and I had fun thinking about this, because I also am curious to see what people think what my words mean. But I would say, 3. First one is shared. Second one, risk evolved. And the third, transformational.
I love it. And we're just going to leave that without any explanation. We'll let people do their projection, their ink blot projection onto what those mean. And kudos for throwing in a hyphenated word. So share risk evolved totally is legit. I love it, Cody. This has been a very fun conversation. Thank you so much. As I said, we're going to absolutely have to have you back, both about that human risk as well as at the end of the year checking this out. So thank you once again, Cody.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you for having me.
Also appreciate Kalyani and Adrian joining once again, sharing their thoughts as well. I want to thank everyone else for joining us as well. Please remember to subscribe, share us on the socials, check out the show notes, and speaking of going into a new year, check out Ether Drift by ComTrues. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.